So hello everyone, Magnus. Carlsen spoke about this young Turkish player Erdogmus, and they met at the World Rapid Championship. And Carlsen said about Erdogmus that he was the strongest player in history at just 14 years old. No player at that age had ever been as strong as him. So let's take a look at Erdogmus's play. He's facing Erigaisi, a top player. Erigaisi starts with c4, the English opening, and this game is going to be very surprising in the opening. Just watch. Erdogmus replies with e5. For now, it's standard. g3, typical of the English opening, putting the bishop on the long white diagonal and the pawn. c4 helps control the d5 square. Black play knight to f6. There's going to be a battle for control of the d5 square. Bishop to g2 and c6 to support the d5 push. Knight to f3 attacks the pawn on e5, which is pushed to e4. The knight comes to d4, pushed to d5. White play d3. And you can see how the battle is shaping up on the central white squares. Both pawns attack d5 and e4, and the bishop as well. And now Erdogmus plays queen to b6. He puts pressure on the knight. The knight retreats to b3. And we're only at the 7th move of the game, and it's already a novelty, because Erdogmus is about to play a move that has never been played before. He plays knight g4. Beginners are often told not to move the same piece multiple times in the opening and not to bring out their queen. And what are Black doing? They've brought out the queen, and the only other piece they've developed besides the queen is the knight, and they're moving it again. The threat is terrible. The threat. Queen takes f2, checkmate. So white can simply play kingside castling to solve the problem, and white are better developed. They have castled already. But Erdogmus's idea is to follow up with the push to e3. He comes to hit the pawn on f2, the defenses of the white king. Here, Erigaisi doesn't really want to take because the knight recaptures forest, the fork. He would have to concede the bishop on the dark square. And the queen could then recapture with check. So Erigaisi prefers to play f3. He pushes back the knight, but in fact the knight does not retreat. It digs into the white camp. Knight f2 attacks the queen. So queen c2, knight h3, check. And now white are faced with a dilemma. Either they give up their light square bishop or they play king chain. But if they play king chain, it could lead to a repetition of moves. For example, if white play king chain, which did not happen in the game, the knight can come back to f2 with check. And if the king returns to g1, we play knight h3 again. And you know that if a position repeats 3 times in a game, it results in a draw. So Erigaisi has white. He is the favorite in this game, with a higher rating and more experience, so Erigaisi won't want to repeat the moves. He plays bishop, takes h3, so black recapture, attacking the rook, which moves to d1. And d4 is played, and this position is quite amusing, with the bishop on h3 really trapping the white king, the e3 pawn, protected by the d4 pawn, which is suffocating the white pieces. We're only on the 12th move of the game, and I've rarely seen an opening take such a turn. So it could turn into a disaster for white, actually, if they didn't have the move, c5. Because this move, c5, is going to cause the collapse of black's pawn structure. c5 is played, queen d8, and now the pawn on d4 can be taken with queen c4. Knight a6 to counterattack the pawn. c5, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes c5, bishop takes e3, and queenside castling. And all of a sudden, the position that was closed is now completely open. So what do we notice? We notice that white have one extra pawn, that's true. But black have the bishop pair, and black, who were initially less well developed, now find themselves well developed. All the pieces are in play and the rooks are already connected, adding even more pressure. On the knight on d4, which can't go just anywhere because there's the bishop on e3, directly in line with the bishop on c5. So white play knight to c2 to defend the bishop on e3. Rook to e8, king to f2 to come and defend the bishop. And knight to b4, an attempt to distract the white knight. If the white knight takes the black knight, then we can play bishop. Takes on e3, check, or even better actually. I think that after knight takes we could play rook takes. And we keep the discovered threats, for example, the threat of rook takes d3 with a check from the bishop. So in the game, after knight b4, white don't take, they develop. Knight to a3 to connect the rooks and solidify the knights. And now, what will Erdogmus play? What would you play in this position with black? I'm curious. You can pause the video. So what did you think of? Here, Erdogmus is going to make an exchange sacrifice. Rook takes, bishop, the knight recaptures. And now the knight on e3 and pinned on the diagonal. It's true that Erdogmus is down a pawn in the exchange. On the other hand, he has a very active pair of bishops, and white are struggling with pin because of the knight on e3. Black are going to play f6 now. Why do they play f6 and not rook e8, for example, to attack the knight? Well, that would allow white to play d4. That's why black hold back. For now, control over the d4 square, and the bishop on h3 risks being trapped by a g4 push. So f6 is played. In addition, it attacks the pawn on a2 and prevents the knight on c3 from coming back to defend. If knight to c2, we could capture without the knight on e3 being able to recapture, and if knight to c4, we would take with the f. For example, knight c4, we would take with the bishop, and even if the pawn recaptures rook e8, we attack the knight twice without white being able to play rook d3 because of the knight. And we even threaten knight c2 again to attack the pinned knight and the rook. So after this move, bishop e6, white decide to play d4. They give up a pawn to relieve the congestion. Rook takes d4, king e1, rook takes d1 check. You have to recapture with the knight because the bishop is attacking. And black were down the exchange and a pawn, but they got a pawn back by taking the pawn on d4. And now they're going to get another one, a second one with knight takes a2. And so we have this position where white have the exchange, that's true, they have a rook, but black have the bishop pair and an extra pawn. With play on both wings, because white have a majority of 4 pawns against 3 on the king side, but black have a majority of 3 pawns against 1 on the queen side, plus the bishop pair, which can support the advance of this pawn's majority, because now the goal is to advance with the majorities to create passed pawns, of course. White plays king's d2, the pawn to b5, taking space, mobilizing the majority, knight comes to c2, then a5, knight comes to c3, there's an exchange, knight takes, pawn takes, and a4. We see this passed pawn and this pair of bishops. So it's not easy for the rook to shine in the fight because you have to deal with this advance, with this wave of pawns on the queen side. White play a4, mobilizing their own majority. King to c7, improving the position of the king. f4, g6, and now white play knight to d4. The computer recommends taking the knight here, but that's not what Erdogmus is going to do. But the computer shows taking the knight, then king to b6 to advance with the 2 connected passed pawns, the king and the bishop. And good control of the d5 square to prevent the d4 pawn from advancing. In this position, the young Turkish player is not going to not take the knight, instead he plays bishop to c4. Pawn to e5, the bishop retreats to e7, pawn to g4, and Erigaisi also mobilizes his majority of 4 pawns against 3. c5, the knight is pushed back and comes to c2, king c6, the knight comes to e3, attacking the bishop which comes to b3. Now that the bishop is on b3, it protects the pawn on a4, and the pawn on b5 could play b4. White to move f5, still with the intention of mobilizing the majority and creating a passed pawn. But this push to f5 frees up the g5 square and the bishop settles on g5. The pair of bishops is deadly in this position. They're like real knitting needles or a pair of scissors. So what do white do? They play king d3, freeing themselves from the pin. Bishop f4, we attack both pawns. King e4, the bishop is attacked. If we take the pawn on h2, I think there would be rook h1, with a counterattack on the pawn h7. Here, Erdogmus prefers to play g5 to secure the protection of his bishop and maintain control of the pair of bishops in the position. White play h4 to try to divert the g5 pawn from defending the bishop. But what will Erdogmus do? What would you do? And you yourself? You can pause the video. And so here, Erdogmus chooses to take the knight and then take the h4 pawn. Granted, he gives up the pair of bishops, but he gets a passed pawn on the h-file, while he also has a passed pawn on the a-file. So he has 2 very distant passed pawns. White play king d2, but bishop d5. Look at the bishop, very interesting. It controls the key square. And here white are going to make a mistake. They're going to play rook e1, which is understandable, putting the rook to support the e6 push and also to get a passed pawn for white. But in reality, this move is going to lose. What was the only move to keep fighting with some equality in the position? I invite you to pause the video. Careful, it's not easy at all. What would you play with white? So, what did you think of the only move here that allows you to keep going and hope to draw or even win? If black makes a mistake, it's g5. Why this move? With g5, the idea is to play e6 to deflect the pawn on f7, and then play g6 to create a passed pawn farther from the king. It's very complicated, it's not easy to understand, but the computer considers this the best line for white. In the game, Erigaisi played rook to e1 to support this push to e6, but that allows the king to come back and be close enough to contain the pawn of white. White plays rook to e3 to control the h3 square, but a 3 it advances. On the other side, the king comes to c1, bishop to g2 to ensure the protection of the pawn on h4 so it can go to h3, e6. Check. Here you could take, but Erdoğan is precise to the end. He plays king e8, capture on f7, check, king takes, rook a6, b4, g5, b3. Now, there are 3 very distant passed pawns for black, whereas white only have a single passed pawn on f5, and for now there is no way for white to promote this pawn. Rook f6, check, king g8. Here, the rook comes back to e6, but b2 check, king c2, pawn h3, and obviously Erigaisi, here with white, decides to resign because there is no longer any way to contain the black pawns. Erdogmus is truly a phenomenon. Don't hesitate to leave me comments, let me know what you think, share the video, give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and we'll meet again soon for new adventures. Goodbye everyone.